And I'm just going to begin at verse 5. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation.
It was a typical Monday morning, and I was walking my kids from our vehicle to car, and my daughter Finley, walking to school, looks up to me, and she says, my backpack is too heavy. It's too heavy to carry. Can you carry it, Dad? And being a gracious and considerate father I am, I said, no. You carry your backpack. But kids have a way of being persistent, and she kept persisting that it was so heavy, so I finally relented and said, fine, I'll take your backpack. And as I grabbed her backpack, I instantly knew that there were too many items in this backpack. It weighed about 60 pounds for this school backpack. And so right there on the sidewalk, I opened it up, and I began to discover multiple sweaters. She was currently wearing a sweater, but there was more sweaters in it. There was yesterday's lunch containers, 7 books. Some of them weren't even from the school, but apparently she had a lot of reading motivated for that day. All of last month's homework was also found in this backpack. Some toys, which are like contraband at school. You're not supposed to bring them, and all kinds of other things squeezed into this backpack. I said, Finn, you don't need all this extra weight. Why are you carrying it? And she responds, I might need it. I think the backpack is a good representation for our lives. The reality is that in life, we are all carrying things that we have packed or that someone else has handed to us. Products from our family of origin or from our culture that we grew up in or the socioeconomic position we had or even more sad, like some trauma that we've experienced or abuse. Our childhood experiences, all of these have affect how we live today. Our past informs our present. And today, you may feel stuck because you're carrying baggage, you're carrying weight that you were never meant to keep carrying. And some of you feel today some of you, as you think through this, some of the weight you feel today, it comes from the wounds. It comes from the patterns that have been placed in your backpack long ago. And you can't move forward until you're willing to look at what you have been carrying on this journey called life. So what baggage are you carrying today? For some of us, we need to open up our backpacks and pull out what's in there. We need to examine the extra weight that we're carrying on the journey. Or to put it another way, the emotional wounds and pain of your past that affect your emotional health today. The emotional pieces of the pain, the wounds, the things that have happened in our life have a real effect of how we talk about emotional health today. We are in a series titled Emotional Health, where it is our core conviction that our discipleship to Jesus, that following Jesus happens from the inside out. In other words, we can't ignore the inner parts of who we are. That following Jesus means looking at those parts and examining them. And today, we will be discussing the importance of going back in order to move forward. Because we are unable to have this conversation of emotional health without establishing the roots or the origins of your emotional pain. Where do those things come from? Most likely, they are something that you've put in your backpack from years ago. And moreover, many of us have learned how we interact with our emotions based on our family of origin that we grew up with or the culture that we were part of. For example, if the family that we grew up with avoided conflict, you may have grown up believing that you can't express what you perceive as negative emotions. You believe like emotions like anger are not allowed to be expressed and therefore they should be suppressed. Now, some of you, as I begin to open this topic and even to begin to just open that zipper a little bit, some of you have real hesitancies about digging up your past. And for good reason. What benefit will this have, Jordan? And more importantly, some of you are thinking, well, listen, as followers of Jesus, Paul says we are a new creation. The old is gone and the new has begun. We don't need to dwell in these things back there because we are facing onwards what Christ has for us. Therefore, Jordan, we don't need to look at our past. We don't need to dig these things up. Yes, we are becoming new creations. And I think that word becoming is so critical. Because part of our discipleship to Jesus and stepping into this creation and this new identity he has, it means bringing our whole selves into that process, which is including our emotional pain, which is including our baggage and the things that we're carrying. As Pete Scazzaro pointedly says, Jesus may be in your heart, but grandpa's in your bones. Or your uncle, or your grandmother. They're all interconnected with who we are today. And even if you're here today and you wanted to ignore your past and pretend that it has no effect on your present day, you simply could not. It will show up in all sorts of ways. If you bury and stuff down your emotional pain, it will show up later and somewhere else. Many individuals that I get to sit down with and have conversations with, many times, many of them have not dealt with their past. And the result from that is they self-medicate to address the symptoms of their emotional pain. They find ways to numb the pain that they're experiencing that they don't want to address. For some, it's casual sex. For others, it's excessive hours of video game. Another series on Netflix, over-drinking, overworking, smoke a little pot, consistent online shopping, or even the drug of choice for some is another Bible study, another church service, some more podcasts, and all of it is an effort to avoid what is that emotional wound that's under the surface that we don't want to pay attention to. The undercurrent is there and not today. Dealing with your past is vital. It is crucial. It is a necessary step in following Jesus and our discipleship to him. If we are truly going to follow Jesus from the inside out, we need to look in what's inside of us. And so for today, we're going to examine a biblical theology of what is called generational sin. Welcome to church. So glad you're here today. If a friend invited you, I apologize. We're usually a little bit more chipper. But today, we're going right for it. Generational sin. So if you have a Bible, I invite you to turn to Genesis 12. We're actually going to be moving throughout the book of Genesis, looking at this theme. But as you make your way there, again, I want to quote Pete Scazzaro from his great book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And in it, he frames this conversation for us. This is what he says. In emotionally healthy churches, people understand that their past affects their present ability to love Christ and love others. Let me say that again. I think that's really important. In emotionally healthy churches, people understand how their past affects their present ability to love Christ and to love others. They've realized from Scripture and life that there's an intricate, complex relationship that exists between the kind of person they are today and their past. Numerous external forces may shape us, but the family we have grown up in is the primary and, except in rare instances, the most powerful system that will shape and influence who we are. There's all kinds of different factors and different aspects from your past that will influence you. But the greatest impact comes from your family of origin. Now, in a biblical sense, don't think of family of origin just simply as your parents and if you have siblings, but think of it as your entire extended family, including that weird uncle that you try to avoid at Thanksgiving, and those grandparents that maybe you've never met. All of this is part of how the Bible thinks about family. Now, before I move forward, I understand this subject may be new for some of you, but for others of you that have maybe been in church for a while have heard different things about it. And I think this subject actually has a lot of confusion and a lot of hesitation around it. Even as I was preparing for this Sunday, I was hard-pressed to find material written about it. But the more I understand it and the more I study this topic, it's a very clear biblical concept. But let me just clarify before some of you start leaving. Generational sin is a concept that's sin. And now when I say the word sin, I mean sin is things that we do, but also things that are done to us or things that are done around us. Sin is way more comprehensive. So generational sin is the concept that sin can have a generational impact to the third and fourth generations. In other words, families don't just pass DNA, but they also pass patterns. There is both biblical and scientific evidence that more than our genes is passed on from one generation to the next. Epigenetics, a new scientific research area, and other scientific research are demonstrating that our social conditions, especially within our families, are being passed on to the next generation. I don't have time to unpack all the research, but it's becoming more and more apparent. So for us today, in this context, for us best to understand the impact of generational sin, we want to look at one of the most prominent family lines we have in the line of Scripture, which is known as the Abrahamic line, which the majority of Genesis follows. So if you have your Bibles, I invite you to turn to Genesis 12. We're going to be in verse 1. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you." Here, God takes this nomad from his family of origin, from what he knows, from his culture, from his place that he lived, and he brings him out to a new place to become a new family line. And the whole purpose is God would bless Abraham to be a blessing to the nations, that God would show his presence through the person of Abraham. No small task. So Abraham becomes the father of faith. But that said, Abraham is certainly a complicated character, which we'll soon find out that he is full of flaws and fears. So Genesis 12, just go down to verse 10, and we first see some of this play into place. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know that you are a beautiful woman, you are. So when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but let you live. So say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." So when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. "What have you done to me?" he says. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?" So here we see Abraham in this moment, he lies to protect himself. He lies to sacrifices his wife's safety for his own. On top of that, he financially profits from this whole deceiving interaction that he has. Out of fear, Abram makes a decision. But it doesn't stop there. Genesis 20. Let's carry on. Verses 1. Now Abraham moved from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And for a while he stayed in Gerar. And there, Abraham, his name has changed here, said of his wife Sarah, wait for it, she is my sister. Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. This was a very misogynistic time that women were seen as property, and people would, if they liked something they saw, they would simply acquire and take it, especially if it's just someone's sister. And then Abimelech has this whole kind of weird scenario, this whole dream that happens where he discerns that this is actually not Abraham's sister, but is actually his wife. So Abraham and Abimelech in one sentence. Thank you. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said, "What have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you have brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that should never be done." Notice this is not an isolated experience. This is a pattern, Abraham, of lying to protect himself. And what's interesting is what happens in one generation, it goes from father to son. A few more pages to the right in Genesis 26, verse 6. Now we pick up Abraham's son, Isaac. Abraham has actually his two sons from two different mothers. There's lots of dysfunction in this family. In verse 6, now there was a famine in the land. Ooh, that sounds familiar. Besides the previous famine in Abraham's time, and Isaac went to Abimelech, same king of the Philistines in Gerar. And when the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, "She is my sister." I wonder where he learned that from. Because he was afraid to say, "She is my wife." He thought the men of this place might kill me on the account of Rebekah because she is beautiful. And so, verse 8, when Isaac had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down from where his castle or his palace was, and he looked down at Isaac doing husbandly kind of marriage things with Rebekah. At least we hope so. If this is a sister, this is a whole other kind of can of fish we have here. But anyways, and so Abimelech summoned Isaac and said, "She's really your wife. Why did you say she is my sister?" So you see this pattern is passed on in the same city with the same king. But it doesn't end there. Isaac goes on to have two sons, Esau and Jacob, and you see this pattern continue in the next chapter, in chapter 27. So Jacob and Esau are two brothers, and there's this tension between them, and the mother, Rebekah, favors Jacob, and so Esau is ready to receive his blessing as the oldest son. The blessing would go to the oldest son. So Esau goes out to get some meat, to have this whole ceremony for Isaac to bless him. And in that moment, Jacob comes into the scene and pretends to be Esau. It's great cinematography, great writing here in Genesis. Verse 18, he went to his father and said, "My father." "Yes, my son," he answered. "Who is it?" Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn." Clear lie, clear deception. "I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game so that you may give me your blessing." Which Isaac is a bit confused because this is very fast. Esau just left, and this would take a long time to go and find game to eat and prepare it. And Isaac asked his son, "How did you find it so quickly, my son?" And notice the spirituality that he mixes into his deception. "The Lord your God gave me success," he replied. See, we see in Jacob that he doesn't simply lie to some foreign king and that he's worried about killing himself. He now lies to his very father, and he steals his brother's blessing. And you can see now how this deception has become integrated into Jacob's life. Jacob's name in Hebrew is Yaakov, which actually is a word picture that means cheater or deceiver. This unaddressed pattern doesn't remain insignificant. It actually grows and can become someone's very identity. In one generation, we see Abram make a decision out of fear. The next generation, this becomes a normalized behavior for Isaac. And then the third generation, this pattern becomes Jacob's very identity. We see clearly through this family line the impact of generational sin has, that patterns that pass from one generation to another. And there was all kinds of dysfunction through Abraham's family. You should read it. It's quite fascinating. There's dysfunction of misogyny, which you clearly see through these stories, and favoritism, multiple partners, and deception. All of this you see is actually passed through the generations. So what does this all mean? What does this tell you and I about generational sin? Well, the clearest understanding of this biblical concept is that the consequences of sins are passed down to the next generation. In fact, I could give you many examples in society and culture that demonstrate this. But let me give you one that I know is sensitive, but I think the evidence is quite clear. And it's with parents who split and the father becomes absent from the family. Scott Galloway has been one who has frequently written and spoken to this reality. And he describes family dysfunction and anxiety that's found in a family, and stress becomes what he calls the emotional inheritance of their children. The Bible would call generational sin. He calls emotional inheritance. He says the absence of a father in a family, especially for boys, is the greatest factor in risk of poverty, academic failure, and emotional instability of that boy. No other factor is a greater predictor of a boy having challenges in their life than if the father is absent. The sins of one generation, the consequences of those are passed down to the next generations. Now, some of you are sitting here and you have real challenges, and you're wrestling with some objections. And let me just try to answer some of the objections that I would imagine be in your head today. First of all, to clarify, generational sin does not mean in some way that you are cursed. You are not responsible for the sins of your parents or your grandfather or your uncle. However, we do clearly observe that the future generations unfortunately bear the consequences of those sins. And now some of you are sitting here, you're like, my family's great. I've got a really good family, Jordan. Maybe you've got some dysfunction, but my family, like, nothing there. Nothing in my backpack. I feel lighter. Even if you have a great family, it has its own dysfunction. I would imagine if you invited me to your Christmas dinner and I got to spend Christmas afternoon with you, I would see some of those dysfunctions and patterns play out. This, I would say, is probably one of the most challenging parts for Amy and I with parenting, because no matter how hard we try, no matter how intentional we are, no matter how many books we read, no matter how much we try to show up for our kids, we are not perfect. And in different ways, we will pass on negative aspects to them. We will try to mitigate it, but it would just be the reality of life. I think this is actually really also a hard concept for many, especially here in Vancouver, because we live in an overly individualistic culture. And we think that for many of us, what we've got from our family of origin or from our parents is our ethnicity and our height and maybe some of their personality type. But we think that's all that's been passed down to us. But even if you've severed ties from your family and you have no relationship with them, you're still so deeply connected to them, whether you like it or not. Patterns are passed on. It's why we say things like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Like mother, like father, like we know this intuitively to be true. Things are passed on, patterns are repeated, and the whole thing, the whole importance of why we're having this conversation is not making you to feel gloom and doom today. It's the reality is what you don't address, you repeat. What you're not aware of, you will perpetuate. This is my story. I literally moved to the other side of the country from my family, not of any intentional way of getting away from them, but I think my young 20-year-old self thought that as I left home, I was starting a new path and a new reality, and those things from my past were not so important because there's a new place. And actually, as faith became more alive for me, so much of my understanding to discipleship to Jesus was forward moving. It's like, what new habit, what new discipline, what new thing is God going to create in my life? It's all moving forward. It's all about what's next. I really like that. But I would find myself in my late 20s and my early 30s starting to address the weight in my backpack. It would trip me up here and there. I remember started sitting down in a counseling session. I'd be talking about some anxiety I have at work, and they would want to talk about my childhood. And I would have to reframe for the counselor because I thought they missed it. I say, no, sorry. About my current day problem, about my workplace and this anxiety I'm having with this coworker. And they gently would say, yes, Jordan, we're going to get to that, but before we can move forward, we have to go back first. And as I started to spend more time reflecting on my own life, I can see patterns that I've inherited and I have repeated. Recently, my mother was visiting from the East Coast. We were at the airport, and she was there with her partner, and the two of them spent 5 minutes about putting the suitcases in the trunk. My mom was very particular about how the suitcase had to go into the trunk. I wasn't sure why we were spending so much time on this, but we spent 5 minutes, and no, we got to put this way and that way, and there was this whole discussion between her and her partner, and later on, as I was reflecting in some quiet time, I was thinking about that incident, and I'm like, wow, look at my mom, and I was like thinking about how many other places that she's very particular about how things are done. And almost in that moment, the Holy Spirit just like dropped it on me, and she said, and that's like you, Jordan. And at the surface, it like doesn't sound that bad. I'm just particular. I like things a certain way. And some of you are like, I can understand and I appreciate that. But the result is it's created this rigidness in me that I like things done a certain way. And when they're not done a certain way, this can lead to real frustration, which actually becomes passive sometimes in my place. And I don't always am aware of it, but I stuff the emotions I'm feeling because things aren't happening a certain way, because I want them a certain way. And at times, this can create in me a critical spirit, and I can become impatient and judgmental. Someone recently asked me if I had some feedback on something, in which I gently responded, I have feedback for everything. It's not hard for me to find feedback, not hard for me to think of how things could be better or how we can improve things. You just ask my family or the team I work with, they're well aware of this aspect. But I would respond with different realities would show up. I can see that I'm become, like my family's ultra competitive. We would argue, and we will never admit defeat. In so many ways, as the more I unveil this pattern in my life, the more I'm aware of it, the more I've come a long way. I really have. But my point is that there are patterns in my family that I've noticed that I've inherited, and I would imagine there's some in yours as well. And the point of this exercise is not to shift blame. The point of this exercise is actually for understanding. I actually found by doing this work, I have created greater compassion for my parents and for my family. I think about the trauma they experience at young ages. And it just gives me a different perspective on how I'm even processing and how so much of their life things were passed on to them. But hear me, the past informs your present, but does not determine your future. This is the beautiful thing about the songs we have sung all morning. This is the gospel. This is the message that Christ brings us, that we, through the power of God, we can find healing from our past emotional pain. My life is a living testimony to that. The power of God is that He can heal us from our wounds and our trauma. He can rewrite the scripts that have come to define us. When you look through the Genesis story and the Abrahamic line, you see that this pattern of dishonesty was actually passed on to the fourth generation. And then you see that Jacob's son, Joseph, was a favorite, and his brothers were jealous of this, and so they sell him into slavery, and they lied about this whole thing. They lied that he died from some animal, and they sold him into slavery. You think your siblings are bad. But the end of Genesis' story and the end of Joseph's life, you see how Joseph, through this whole process, remains integral and continues to trust in God. And you see that through Joseph's obedience and through Joseph trusting in the power of God in his life, he breaks the family pattern of sin. By the very end of the story, his brothers are there, and it's this beautiful story, but he offers forgiveness to his family and to his brothers. And the end of Joseph's story is one of the most beautiful, redemptive endings we see in Scripture. You read it and you feel the emotion. All the brothers are crying in a culture that would be so rare. But you see how Joseph trusted in God, and he literally rewrote a pattern. Something ended with Joseph's line. Something ended with his family. And the same is for you and I as well. These patterns and emotional wounds do not define you, and you can experience the grace of God. So what do we do with all this? What do we do with this weight that I've maybe put on you that you're carrying? Well, I think there's the clear implication is that we become aware of it. It's the whole point of this series. It's about looking inside. It's becoming aware of these things. But the big point here around this subject is that you have agency. The verdict of your life is not already established. Your future is still being written. And so how do we do that? 3 things real quick. First, we notice the pattern. Similar to what Amy said last week about just noticing why are we feeling certain ways and being in tune with those emotions. But for some of us, it's discerning the patterns. What are the behaviors? What are the scripts? What are the emotions that we're feeling? So we notice the pattern, but the second step, and this goes a layer deeper than what Amy talked about next week, is retrace it. This is the next level of asking, what part of my past has influenced this current reality I'm experiencing? Because more often than not, it's connected to something. Recently, I was sitting down with a young adult who was talking about his romantic relationship, and the way that the individual was talking about their relationship, it sounded like they had some experience in relationships. And I asked, is this your first relationship, or have you dated before? In which they respond, this is the first relationship they had. And I said, that's interesting. You have great maturity in how you're thinking about this topic. Where did that come from? He paused, and then he started describing his parents' relationship and their marriage. He's like, there's some good things there, but there's some other things that I don't want to perpetuate in mine. I don't want to repeat those patterns. I want my relationship to look different. Now, of course, there are good patterns, and there are negative patterns that our families pass on, not just bad ones. We've been focusing on the negative, but there are good things that our families pass on to us. We are a mixed bag. When I sit down with couples through premarital before they get married, I ask, what's one thing you want to repeat? What's one thing you want to bring into this new family? And what's one thing we just want to leave back there? We don't want to take with us. The point is just becoming aware of it, tracing it, understanding where it comes from. I'm going to invite the keys to come back, and I want to end with this. This is where pop psychology ends. This is where, maybe they'll give you some mindful tactics to do with this or some ways of journaling. But for you and I, in this context, there's a third, and it's a critical step. We invite Jesus into this process. In preparation for the series, a friend of mine recommended the book Try Softer. It's written by a Christian therapist. Her name's Andi Kolber, and in it she discusses many themes that we're talking throughout the series. It's a recommendation we'll put up later this week. But she says this at one point. Again and again, he comes for us, speaking of Jesus. He lovingly finds us. He makes a way where there was no way. As a Christian, this makes my heart rejoice. And as a therapist, it makes me ecstatic. Like the missing puzzle piece that fits snugly and completes the pictures of our lives, God himself is our best resource, the safe, the best attachment we could ever have. Our encouragement is don't go on this journey alone. Invite Jesus into the process with you. Go there with Jesus. And this process of exploring these pieces, it never ends. But it's a continued process of us unpacking and going deeper and understanding more of these things. And the more we do, we allow God to rewrite the narratives of our lives. The more I do this, the more I experience the grace of God in my life. The more I experience God in these moments. So with all that being said, the role of the follower of Jesus is to be aware of our patterns. But please don't do this alone. Going back can open up the enemy's work in your life, and this is something that you need to do with others. So maybe you're part of a small group and there's one or two trusted people in there. Maybe it's a trusted friend. For some of you, maybe it's finding a therapist. We have such a high view of therapy, we can't recommend it enough, but for each of us, it's different. So don't ignore your past. Bring it into light with Jesus and with others.